Franziska. Welcome to my course, which is devoted to the introduction to pragmatics. I hope that the series of lectures on pragmatics will provide you with a fuller and deeper understanding of human linguistic behavior. The first lecture of the series is to give you a general idea of what pragmatics is all about, what it does, and why we need it. For a long time, linguists maintained that communication and interpretation were not topics that submitted to scientific study. Thus, they claimed that a pragmatic theory was not possible because they were mainly interested in formal aspects, in formal systems of analysis. So the emphasis was on discovering certain abstract properties of language that lie at the core of language, and they were mainly interested in establishing a number of potentially universal features in terms of which language can be described. And we may say that that approach derived from mathematics and logic. In the 50s, there was a dramatic pragmatic turn, and this pragmatic turn was taken within the philosophy of language as a reaction to this formal approach. The so-called ordinary language philosophers, such as Austin or Strawson, the later Wittgenstein or Grice, tried to describe natural language meaning as used by ordinary people, and they were simply dissatisfied with the description in terms of logic. So they simply believed that description was not sufficient. So they were reacting to the practice of studying exclusively invariant, explicit content, because they believed that that approach had led to a gross underestimation of the context sensitivity typical of natural language utterances. So they tried to redress the imbalance and somehow to reconcile these two approaches. So the formal one and the one that takes into account context sensitivity. Now, if you look at the definitions of syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, you will notice why syntax and semantics were considered to be the legitimate domains of formal linguistics, for formal linguistic analysis, and pragmatics was not. So syntax is defined as describing the relationships between linguistic forms and how they are arranged in sequences to make well-formed sentences. Semantics is defined as describing the relationship between linguistic forms and entities in the world, that is, how words literally connect to things. Semantics is also interested in the relationships between verbal descriptions and state of affairs in the world. So semantics establishes whether these verbal descriptions are accurate with respect to the state of affairs that they are to represent, so whether they are true or false. Pragmatics is defined as the exploration of the relationships between linguistic forms and the uses of these forms. So you can notice that pragmatics is the only one in this three-party distinction that allows humans into the analysis. So in that respect it is different. The advantage of studying language via pragmatics is that you can talk about the speaker's intentions, his or her assumptions and conversational goals, but the disadvantage of that approach is that these human concepts are pretty elusive and they are very difficult to to be described in formal terms, objective formal terms. In syntax, we deal with sentences. So a sentence is a unit of analysis within syntax. In semantics, in logic, it is a proposition, that is a thought that is conveyed in a sentence. But in pragmatics, we deal with utterances. So as I've mentioned, natural languages do not behave in the same way as this ideal logical language, and a number of phenomena cannot be described accurately in terms of logic. So all these instances have been somehow relegated to the wastebasket. So we may say that pragmatics originated from these wastebasket problems. And just to give you a couple of examples, so syntax is mainly interested in well-formedness of sentences, thus whether it is the bottle of ketchup ran up to Mary and licked her, or the duck ran up to Mary and licked her, or the dog ran up to Mary and licked her, does not make any difference at all, because all of them are well-formed sentences from the syntactic point of view. But of course not every one of these sentences is equally acceptable in pragmatic terms. The bottle of ketchup ran up to Mary and licked her does not make much sense. So you may assume that perhaps if we add some semantic considerations, then we will be able to explain why the bottle of ketchup is not acceptable. And this is true because obviously the verb to run demands the animate subject, so that rules out the bottle of ketchup, but still we are left with the duck and the dog, and still we believe that the dog is somehow more acceptable in the context than the duck, and here, as you can see, this is not a semantic choice. So what prompts you which of these two is acceptable and which is not is your knowledge of the world. This is what is expected of dogs, but not of ducks. So this is the context that decides which of these sentences is acceptable. So this is already a pragmatic interpretation. Another problem arises with conjunctions. So conjunctions, that is two propositions joined by the conjunction and you can reverse the order of two conjuncts. This is what you can do in logic, and still the truth conditions of these propositions remain the same. That is, the truth condition of the whole proposition of two conjuncts together are the same. So if we take an example, Tom likes bananas and Mary likes oranges, and then reverse the order, Mary likes oranges and Tom likes bananas, then obviously they are true under the same conditions. But not all natural languages conjunctions are fully reversible. So if we say she got up and went to the bathroom, then you can notice that this conjunction represents the chronological order, and you cannot change the order of the conjuncts without affecting the meaning of the whole sentence. So as you can see, this is again another pragmatic problem. It has to be somehow resolved contextually, because otherwise you would have to claim that there are different meanings of the word and. Then numerous cases of ambiguity. There is nothing in the semantics or syntax of child actor and child psychiatrist that helps you to identify a child actor as a child, but child psychiatrist as not a child. And it is fortunate that family butcher does not do the same thing to families as pork butcher does to pigs, but you cannot get that meaning from the syntactic structure, nor from the semantic considerations here. It is again the context that provides you with the clue how to understand these structures. And again, if you look at no shoes, no ties, no service, on the basis of that elliptical utterance, you can build up a whole proposition saying that if you do not put on your shoes and if you have no tie, then you will be not served. But again, there is nothing in the structure of that sentence, nor in the semantic meaning of its constituents, that is responsible for that interpretation. So what follows is a discussion of some basic properties of everyday communication that lie in the heart of pragmatics, that are interesting for pragmatics. So we'll start from appropriateness of language use in relation to those who use it and those they address. So this is something that you know from your own experience, that you try to select such forms that are suitable in a particular context. So you change the register, so you change the style of your speech. So you may speak formally or semi-formally or informally. You may take into account the person of the addressee, but you may also take into account bystanders, and then you somehow try to make your language perhaps more decent in a way. So instead of saying something bluntly, you just go for a more indirect option. So for instance, the teacher coming to the class usually gets the audience's attention by saying, "Shall we begin?" by what he or she means that it's time to start a lecture, so perhaps it's time to stop talking. So this is just an example of appropriateness, but obviously we can use some other where you have to consider the appropriateness of certain linguistic forms, honorifics, for instance, terms of address that are prescribed in particular situations. So we may say that pragmatics deals with the relative distance between the interlocutors as well. Now, so if you are indirect, then obviously you do not say what you mean literary. So literalness is only one aspect of meaning conveyed in an utterance. And if literalness is only one aspect of meaning conveyed in an utterance, it means that the interpretation of an utterance does not merely consist of decoding that what is expected is a lot of inferencing. So much is left for the hearer to infer. And mind you that it is not only the implicit meaning that has to be inferred, but also you have to find the precise, exact meaning of the items that are expressed explicitly, because language is dramatically underdetermined, even in its explicit content. Thus, pragmatics has to account for this human ability to determine the intended meaning at the implicit level and at the explicit level. So if we are back to "Shall we begin?", this interpretation of that utterance as "stop talking because I would like to start my lecture" is the implicit message. But if you look at the examples below, that is "my book" or generally the possessive in English, you will notice underdeterminacy at the explicit level. If I say "my book," you never know whether it is a book that I own, or this is a book that I've written, or this is a book that I borrowed from the library. Now, if you look at the Saxon genitive, Jane's car, Simon's job, Jane's father, yesterday's events, country's president, then if you are to paraphrase each of them, then you will notice that what you arrive at are completely different sentences. which means that each time it is just a completely different enrichment of the same syntactic structure and a completely different understanding of that. Now, if you look again at such two phrases as additive free versus 50% extra free, then you can notice that the interpretation of the word free is different. So even at the explicit level, much has to be inferred. So if pragmatics is the study of how more gets communicated than is said, then inevitably it must be the study of contextual meaning, because you can derive various interpretations only on the basis of the available context. So I've got a flat tire may be a request for help, but it may as well be a refusal, so I cannot give you a lift. Or it may be a request for a lift, or it may be an apology for being late. So a number of options, as you can see. And these options, I mean, which of these options is relevant depends on the context. Another aspect is, that is here phrased in the form of a question: does the context determine the way people use language, or does the way we use language determine the context? And it seems that both, so it is in a way some kind of a vicious circle. But it is not only that the context requires from us certain forms, so this is that aspect that we have already discussed, appropriateness or appropriacy, but that sometimes we, as in a way, prepare the audience for the utterance to come. So if it is going to be something that the hearer is not very happy to hear, then we use such phrases as to prepare the audience for that. So this is using language to create the context. Now, coming back to this first aspect that we've discussed on the context, that the context actually decides which interpretation is to be selected, we are guided in that choice of the interpretation by our search for relevance, that is, what we believe is the most important interpretation in the circumstances, what is the most salient interpretation in the circumstances. Then perhaps we should also pay some attention to reflexive or metalinguistic uses of language, that is, metalinguistic glosses. Speakers make comments on their own linguistic performance, which signal that the speakers themselves are pretty aware of what is expected of them as conversationalists. So that also gives access to our pragmatic awareness. And finally, misfires, that is, pragmatic failures. If we are somehow alarmed by an utterance, if we find it dramatically impolite, or if we find it funny for some reasons, then we in a way can discover that there are certain expected norms that in this particular case have not been obeyed. So it has been relatively easy for us to discuss some basic pragmatic aspects of utterances, but now we'll have to approach them from a more, let's say, academic point of view, and describe them in terms of pragmatic, stricter pragmatic concepts. So we'll, on the basis of the example I'm here now, we'll point to three problematic issues. The first one is deixis. So as you can see, I'm here now is a sentence that is highly context sensitive, because you're expected to resolve contextually under determinacy of who the speaker is and where and when the sentence is uttered. So there are three words, I, here and now, that are particularly context dependent. These are the deictic expressions, and mind you that part of their meaning is invariant, but part of their meaning has to be determined contextually. Okay? So the meaning of the words is cleared, but their references are affected each time they are uttered. So the alternative name for deictic expressions is indexicals, and they constitute a limited number of indeterminate lexical items whose references are determined contextually. So we may conclude that they act as a shorthand for an indefinite number of descriptions. But mind you that communication without indexicals would be extremely complex, if possible at all. Again, the same sentence, I'm here now, but apart from this natural indeterminacy, you can notice indeterminacy stemming from what this particular sentence counts as doing. So you can easily imagine three possible situations in which this sentence is uttered. So it may be an act of reassuring when you come to visit your relative in hospital and you want to reassure him or her that everything is going to be all right because you will see to everything. Or it may be a warning addressed to your children that you've just come home and they're larking about instead of doing their homework. So now, if you are home now, then you may just want them start working. And it may also be an act of apology. You're sorry for having kept your friends so long, but now you're already there, so it counts as an act of apology. So each time you do something with your words, so your utterance counts as a particular speech act. Otherwise, the sentence "I'm here now" has not much sense because it is just stating the obvious. It is the trivial truth which is self-evident. So there must be something beyond the literal meaning, and this is the intention of the speaker. And this intention of the speaker is called the elocutionary force of an utterance. If you are to determine this elocutionary force of the utterance, you obviously should access the context, and this context prompts you what inference should be drawn to make the utterance maximally relevant, that is, to derive the proper interpretation of it, and to decide what speech act a particular utterance represents. So, mind you that apart from expressing an invariant meaning that is encoded, propositions may convey an implied meaning which has to be inferred. Oh, here is just one more example on the basis of which you can discuss these three properties: deixis, speech acts, and implicature. So this is a short dialogue between A and B. "Are you working this afternoon? I'm going back to the office." So you have to determine who I and you are, which afternoon is referred to, and what part of the afternoon has been picked up, whether the sentence was uttered. It is just a different part of the afternoon depending on when exactly the sentence was uttered. In terms of speech acts, again, as many potential speech acts as there are contexts. So A and B can be a couple, and A may just want B to do some shopping on the way, or A may be B's boss, in which case it is just a mild reprimand or perhaps a suggestion that B should start working immediately. Or B may have two workplaces, and A would like to establish which of them he works today. He's working today. Or B has a car and A works near B's office, so perhaps it is again indirect request for a lift. So in terms of implicature, it may be it's time you went to work, for example, that is A and B, A is B's boss, or could you give me a lift, the last of the context, and many others. So this is the implicit meaning that is conveyed. Finally, I would like you to analyze a famous sentence. This was the announcement President Kennedy made soon after the Berlin Wall had been erected. And even though the sentence was grammatically incorrect and semantically false, it was understood, and President Kennedy was applauded and enthusiastically welcome. So instead of saying that he was a Berliner, he said he was a donut. But still, it was not fault. It was not an obstacle for the audience to understand the message. So obviously, didactic expression ich. But mind you that perhaps here it is also important that he was the head of the superpower. In terms of speech act, it is an act of reassuring the Berliners and an implied threat to the Russians, and so the act of support, obviously, and implicature is I will stand by West Berlin, I will not desert you, I will help you if the need arises. So a pretty complex message in the form of that utterance. Thank you for your attention.